brief intro to myself. My name is Keith Cowing, and during my career, I've done a bunch of different things, but mostly around building products and building companies. And during my personal transformation, as I went from building products to building teams and building organizations, one of the things that I learned, especially coming from an engineering background, really focused on kind of analytical and technical skills, was the importance of storytelling and selling, whether you're selling to investors or customers or employees or partners, or even people that you have personal relationships with as you're working on your career, on your companies, how important that is. And that's something I really learned along the way. After leaving business school, I started a company and jumped right in and really learned how to sell on the job. And since then, I've spent a lot of time on storytelling and the importance of how that fits into leadership. And that's why I was really excited about bringing Connie here today. Connie and I actually were colleagues in our first jobs out of college. And over time, she's done a bunch of really interesting things. And now she's been a founder and a CEO, and she's a storytelling coach and focuses on how to help people improve their leadership skills through storytelling. So we're super excited to have her here today. And with that, Connie, would love to get a quick intro to yourself and a little bit about your background, and then we can hop right into the discussion.
Yeah, thanks for having me today, Keith. My background is also in product management. In fact, what were we doing? We were doing marketing, product marketing at the time, right? Which is somewhat close to it. Figuring out how to position the product, how to talk about the product, how to basically take it from the salesperson opening up the account to, okay, this is what the actual product is. So engineering background as well. And along the way, I discovered that I didn't really want to sit in a room and code all day. I enjoyed the human interaction part of it, but I'm kind of nerdy, so I like understanding technology. And so I moved into a product management role where I'm able to do both, basically really understand what the technology is and be able to share that with people who might not be in the code every day or in the technology every day. And that's very interesting. So background, Canadian, engineering, and then I moved to California where I started my career and also met Keith, and we worked in semiconductor together, after which I went to solar, I went to enterprise SaaS, I went to Atlassian, Microsoft, worked at many different types of companies, and is a really interesting perspective to see how different companies operate, large and small, and also how different products and the stories that are told about the different products and the different metaphors that we might use depending on the audience that we have.
Excellent. So we were talking earlier, and you're talking about this acting course that you took and how that started a bunch of your focus on storytelling. Can you share that?
Yeah. So about 3 years ago, I met a person named Max. We're friends now, and he has a CS background, but he is full-time actor, theater director, like professional for about 15 years as well. So really interesting guy. And I took a class just on a whim on presentation skills, and we really hit it off. Like we ended up being really good friends because we spoke on the same wavelength, but he came at it from a very different perspective, right? He's been on stage, he's done physical, on stage storytelling, right? How do you take script and turn it into something that really captures people? And I found that skill to be extremely useful. Some of the skills that he broke it down, right? If you work with an actor who doesn't have a technical background, they might not break it down as much as he does. Like he's from CS, so he's really good at just taking the components and boiling it down to the essentials. So he taught me a bunch of skills that were extremely useful in terms of helping me prep for being on stage in front of people or even one-on-one, right? Just being able to take that message and make it super clear. So I kept in touch with him, and later on we started a collaboration where we created a storyteller type system, and we help people understand they're basically one of 6 different storyteller types, and help them understand using that system how they tend to tell stories as a default and how other people might receive the story very differently. So you end up having this gap where you're telling a story, they don't really want to hear the story that way. They use a different narrative by default. And so they're somehow not connecting, and helping people understand, okay, well, maybe I can tell, my story differently, right? There are like 7 different story types or story narratives that are used in Hollywood, say, and they just repeat it over and over. So how do you leverage some of that in your everyday storytelling about, yourself in an interview, about your product if you're pitching to investors, how to convince your child to do the thing you want them to do, right? Like it's as basic as that. How do you leverage some of those narratives that just really capture humans? Because we're storytelling machines. That's what we do.
So on the topic of storytelling, do you have any personal stories that you would love to share?
Yeah. So a bit about me. I want to talk about my grandfather, actually. My grandfather is a fortune teller. And it's a very unusual profession, but he was—
You're basically saying storytelling was already in your blood.
Maybe that's it. Yes, he was blind, right? So his family gave him a skill, hadn't learned a skill that allowed him to operate and make a living. And fortune telling, you can do it without looking. So he would name babies as part of his job, right? Give babies names that help them ward off bad luck and bring good fortune to their families. And he would give them Chinese names, obviously. This was in Hong Kong where I was born. So you can imagine when I was born that I also received the name from him. And if you know anything about Chinese names, you know they're kind of hard to write. And most Chinese names take about 30 pen strokes to write. But my Chinese name took 60 pen strokes to write. Right? So I'm still writing my name by the time my other fellow students finish writing their tests, because you have to write your name on every test back in the day, right? And I was just so frustrated with them, like, why I might have this complicated name? What is up with this name? But then it was revealed to me why I had this name. Because when I was 11 years old, I moved, my whole family did, moved from Hong Kong to Canada. My whole family, my mom, my dad, my grandparents, my uncles, my aunties, everybody, my cousins, because of political situation there. And we moved, and it turns out like my name is two characters. One is Min, which is flexible, and then the other one is Feng, which actually means maple, the maple tree. So somehow through the magic that is my grandfather, he knew that I was going to take this journey. And by the way, the character Feng is like hardly ever used in a name ever. Like it's a really unique character for a name, and it's not used at all. I've never seen it in a girl's name. Like it might be used in a guy's name, like once every like 0.005% of the time, but never in a girl's name. So I have this unique character that like, why would I suddenly have this character? And somehow it connected with me moving to Canada, which is the land of the maples. So I always found that super magical, right? Like that I have this kind of connection with my grandfather and with, I don't know, if there is a heaven and I see him someday, I might have to ask him what is going on here. But yeah, it's really interesting. So I'm Flexible Maple. That is the name I am.
Well, thanks for sharing that personal story. And then one of the things that I thought was really interesting chatting with you was hearing about how you described your engineering brain and your approach to the world, and then acting and how it was very, very different, but kind of pulling those two worlds together. And so we'd love to hear a little bit both about how you've kind of worked with people taking, storytelling from your personal life and bringing it into your business life at work, but then also things that you've seen in terms of bringing sort of skill sets or experiences from very different parts of your world together, and how people can think about, the different aspects of their lives and how you can pull that together to be strong as a leader at work.
Yeah. I work with a lot of CEOs actually, and one of the challenges is we've been taught to separate our personal life from our work life. And we are a full person, right? And so your personal anecdotes and experiences you have, both professionally and personally, and your response to it is very much a part of what shapes you and your story. So when people talk about authentic storytelling, right? Storytelling isn't about creating something fake so that you can get someone to believe you. It's about finding what is true to you and authentic to you, and then bringing that story forward so that you can be more compelling when you talk to the other person, right? So tapping in, and in my class, we actually go through and create personal anecdotes and think through personal anecdotes, because those are the ones that are going to be, when you tell them, it's going to be very authentic on your face, right? It's going to be like, oh yeah, this person actually lived through this experience and I'm stepping in the shoes of this person. Because they took MRI scans of people listening to a story versus somebody actually living the story. So like say rock climbing. They took MRI scans of someone actually rock climbing and someone who's watching a video of someone rock climbing. And they noticed that the brain patterns actually mimic They're the same. It's as if the person laying down in the machine just watching a video of rock climbing is actually rock climbing and practicing rock climbing, right? So it's really powerful, this kind of mirror neurons that we have. And that's why if you're able to bring in an authentic experience of a personal story that ties to what you're working on, then when you tell it, you'll be able to activate those mirror neurons on the other person, and they would actually step in your shoes and fully understand your experience. So that's what we're trying to tap into here, right? And that's why, when I work with CEO, one of the CEOs I worked with, she is at a blockchain company now, and I asked her, like, why are you working on this? And it turns out she used to work at the World Bank and saw firsthand the difficulty of lack of financial inclusion, right? Like people who literally can't get a bank account because they have no identity. And so they're hauling cash around. So she would have to give them cash. You can't just give them, here's your credit card, now you have some money, now you can get started. No, they had to carry suitcases with handcuffs suitcases across dangerous places with very little transportation. I'm talking third world country with dollar bills in them so they can deliver it to the people in need. And on one of these journeys, she hurt herself and she ended up with a cast on her leg. So she ended up taking that cast after it came off and making a lamp out of it to remind herself of this journey that she undertook and what it means for her and why she wants to use blockchain technology to help people who don't have financial inclusion, to include them in the financial system. Because it is so hard. It is crossing mountains and breaking your leg and carrying suitcases of money, right? That's what it means for her. So I think this personal story is so powerful, right? So I'm like, well, you need to tell that whenever you have the chance, when you have the time, because then people would remember you and connect with you and connect with your cause. So it's stories like that I help people pull out. Like something happened in your life that put you on this path. What is that? And how do we tell that story so that you can connect with people and bring them on this journey with you?
And there's two things within that I'd love to dig into a little bit. And one is authenticity. So really bringing your personal self out, not trying to play somebody else, but really being who you are and leaning into that. And then another one is really thinking about the audience that you're telling a story to. And so just as a comment on that for everybody watching, feel free to enter questions as we go. We'll try to intertwine it into the conversation as best we can. And then at the end, we'll take as many questions as we have time for. We'd love to get into content that's specifically helpful for you, either in your personal life or in your work life, and helping you become a better storyteller and a better leader. So on the authenticity side, I'll share a story from my own experience, which is when I was the first founder and CEO for the first time, and I was going and making presentations at conferences, and I was learning how to be a storyteller and how to be a leader and how to project confidence and do all these things. And I had this image in my head of what a sort of powerful, successful CEO looked like. And I was trying to play into that image. And I remember going to a conference and I noticed that sometimes I would introduce myself and people wouldn't hear my name. And I'd have to say it again and say it louder. And I was trying to picture this powerful executive that just projected their voice everywhere. And I was like, I'm not playing that role right. I need to do this better and stronger. And I was there with my co-founder, Ilya, and I introduced myself. I thought I introduced myself strongly and effectively to this woman after a talk that I gave. And then afterwards, Ilya came up to me and he's like, Keith, why didn't you just yell at that woman? And I realized I was just so overcompensating, trying to play this role that I pictured myself needing to be like. And then over time, what I found was that leaning into not really being somebody else or playing that role, but bringing my own self out, led to a natural passion, a natural authenticity. And then I could own a room and I could have the energy and, the eloquent description of an event in a way that was just way more powerful than when I was trying to be something else, or if I was in an environment where I wasn't excited about what I was doing. And so that really, really resonates with me. And we'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that authenticity and how folks that are in the audience can think about that in their own personal lives, of any kind of tactics or recommendations that you have for them to think about how to bring their own storytelling type out. Yeah,
for sure. If you haven't found it yet, go to take this quiz and you can find out for free which storyteller type you are and give you a little bit more detail about what your default is. It's on my website. It's www.productmaestro.com. Connie.com/storyteller. And it's only 5 questions, so super quick, but you get to understand out of 6 types which one you are, right? And then from there, you can either, two ways, you can either lean into that type and just really make that you, right? I think that's one practice is the, hey, this is me, I'm a laid back person. You know, whenever I have a meeting with you, Keith, I'm just gonna sit down and we're just gonna have a coffee, right? Like this is how I convince people, is over coffee. Or I like to be on stage, right? Like I'm visionary and I like to, you know, be very confident, and the CEO type that you were explaining, right? So you, I'm guessing, Keith, is a wise neighbor. You want to get a coffee with somebody, and that's how you're convincing, right? Versus me, I like to be on stage. I like to be, you know, addressing a crowd at once. That's my natural place. Doesn't mean I can't be convincing in the coffee shop, and it doesn't mean you can't be convincing on stage, but it just means that's your default. That's where you're comfortable. And then it's about stretching yourself to the other parts, because those parts are all there. It's just practice, right? It's just you have a comfort zone and you practice that a lot because you show up in the coffee shop a lot because that's where I'm comfortable. And so you get really good at that style, actually. But it doesn't mean you're not good on stage too. So then you practice being on stage. You practice the energy, the style, the body language, the voice, like the different ways that you can be. And it's about stretching. So like, when people are singing, for example, you stretch your voice from your high range to your low range, right? That is your entire range. But mostly you speak in the middle range, right? And so most of us live our lives speaking in the middle range, never singing the high and low notes. So it's about being authentic, like you are able to sing the high and low notes, but it's about practicing those high and low notes over time so you can stretch to those, right? And so that's why, you know, you have lived a while and you've practiced those high and low notes. Now you can get on stage and you can be just as convincing as if you're in the coffee shop. Whereas earlier, you're probably just like, give me the coffee shop all the time, right? Because I love it there. But now you're comfortable in both. So it's a lot of it is about practice and staying authentic in that. When you practice a lot, you'll stay authentic because it is part of you. You just have a lot of options. You have a lot of capabilities that you're not yet aware of.
Excellent. So we've got a number of great questions coming in. I'm going to try to take a couple of them because they're very related to what we're talking about. So first one from Michael, he's asking for some recommendations on how do you work with people when you're coaching, how to structure their story, thinking about the beginning, the middle, the end when you're doing storytelling, and then also how to control the length. How long should it be?
Yes. Okay. Remind me of the second one. I'll talk about the structure first. So every story has a character, obviously. It has an event, some kind of tension that happens. And then there's some kind of resolution. So you have to build that in. You have to introduce a character, right? Connie walked along one day. And then one day, you know, this thing happens, which creates this tension for me as a character. Like I have to either, you know, climb that wall, or I have to chop down that tree, or I have to rescue that bird, whatever it is that suddenly has happened to me. And it makes this excitement, like the audience is like, oh, what's going to happen? Will the bird be rescued? What's going to happen? And then you tell the answer of, okay, she ended up rescuing the bird and this is how she's changed. Or she ended up rescuing the bird and the bird lived on for 10 years. Whatever it is, right? That's the basic story. And you do that for just about everything. And you can do that in very little, with very little information, actually. So speaking of, okay, the second part was length, right? So here's a really great story that you may have read. It's just 4 words. It's an ad. It's the image of an ad. And it says, baby shoes never worn. It's an ad for sale of baby shoes never worn. So that's a story, right? This is a story about, wow, like somebody had this heartbreak and they're now getting rid of the shoes and they've overcome the, so your brain fills it in, right? Your brain's constantly filling in the story. So it's really powerful, like being able to understand story, blow it out in the long form, and then taking the essence and then making it into something that you can communicate in 10 seconds, right? And then the brain will fill it in. So, but what are the pieces you need to put there so that the other person's brain can fill it in? That's what you need to figure out as a storyteller.
And then another question from Jamie. What questions do you ask yourself when you're trying to prepare for different audiences? For example, if you're presenting to middle management at your company versus if you're presenting to the C-suite. Maybe it's the same story, but naturally you're going to have to adjust it a little bit for it to resonate at different levels of the org.
Yes, absolutely. That's a really good observation that you even bring to the table now just by asking that question. And I have a story wheel that I use with students, which basically maps out all the pieces that you could tell, right? Because your story is really complicated. The longer you're in your company, the longer the essay is about the product that you want to write about. So then you write out that essay, you create this map of all the pieces you can talk about. And then you overlay that with what the audience cares about. So executive teams, right? I've worked with a lot of executive teams, so now I understand they care about, okay, broad strokes, where are we headed? What are the risks, right? Risk is always a big one. How do we get there? And what is the benefit of getting there, right? The ROI, right? So you need to make sure you hit those high points from a data perspective and then weave that into a story so they're never bored. Like you always have to make sure everybody in the audience has something going for them as you go in your story so that they don't pull out their phone. Because the risk with the executive team is they have very short attention spans. So in 30 seconds, somebody's going to pull out their phone. So I worry about that when I talk to the executive team. What was another example? The team overall, maybe motivating the development team, right? They care about something else, right? They care more about maintainability of the code, maybe. They care more about quality of the code, right? Like they don't want to ship bad stuff. They care about, their own reputations as a developer. If they're on GitHub or whatever, they want to make sure that whatever they put out is good. So it comes back to like they want to do right as a developer. They want to create good stuff. They're creators, right? So I step in their shoes and I understand what their care abouts are. And then when I craft a story, I pull out the pieces where I'm like, okay, well, we're building this and this is the vision and we're going to do it this way that allows us, to have enough time to build quality code. But, we need to make some trade-offs, right? So let's have that conversation about trade-offs. I understand you want to make quality code. I keep coming back to what I understand to be their care about and confirming that so that they feel like, oh, yeah, we're on the same page. She cares about what I care about. But then also push for the things that I need done, right? Like, we do have to meet this timeline. So how do we come together and build this so that it meets the quality bar that you desire, but also that we both desire, honestly, but also hits the deadline that we need in order to go to market, right? So we come together and kind of create that story together in some ways.
And Sophia was asking a question related to that, which is the best leaders connect with people. And part of that is understanding your audience and adjusting the story. Part of it's just being authentic. But what else do you recommend for people, if they're presenting to the development team or to the C-suite or to the sales team? How do you not only tell the story, but how do you actually personally connect with them so the story resonates and they trust you?
Yeah. There's the classic way, which is just building a relationship. So getting that coffee, going for walks, right? Building that relationship. And the reason for building that relationship, I think that relates to storytelling, is then you get their context. So now you have a better understanding of their care abouts, right? And then when you actually get into the room to do that pitch for, hey, I want you to support my project and give me 10 headcount or whatever it is, when you get into the room, now you have that care about in your mind, so you naturally address it. I think that's the most important. If you don't already have a relationship, say it's an investor who, you're just gonna walk in and do the pitch, right? You can get that perspective by looking at their website and kind of doing a little bit of digging ahead of time and understanding what they care about. Because ultimately it is what they care about, right? You want to speak to what they care about. And then you can use the techniques like in storytelling, like creating that tension and creating that resolution. But the tension, sometimes it's given to you. Like just they come into the room with the care about, and that is the tension that they want you to address with your product. So if you have that intel ahead of time, it's going to be beneficial to you.
And it sounds like a big part of what you're really describing is empathy. And it comes in very different forms, but I've seen frequently that people during their career maybe start from an inside out perspective of here's what I have to say, I'm going to project it onto the world. And if you're given a presentation, the first question is, okay, what should I say? What should my slides be? And then over time, I think a lot of the best leaders flip that. And it's more of an outside-in approach of thinking first about, what is the customer feeling? What is the sales team feeling? What's the engineering team feeling? And then saying, like, what do people want to hear? Like, what do they need? And then turning that into, okay, now what am I going to say? But the first question coming out of somebody's mind is, what are they interested in? What do they need to hear? How can I improve this situation, as opposed to being me first and saying, what am I going to say? How do I project?
Right, right. And that's something I love about you from when I met you in the beginning. I feel like you've always been a great listener, Keith. So this part comes very naturally to you. And you're putting up a really great point, which is it might not for some people. We're given 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, right? Listen twice as much as you speak. And that's actually really true. We say storytelling, but it's really, there's like 80% of the work is the listening ahead of time. So that when you do speak, when you do open your mouth that 20% of the time, something valuable comes out.
And when you think about listening, I frequently say it's one of the biggest things they don't teach in business school, where they teach you to analyze, they teach you to present, they teach you to project. And, I'm slightly being cynical, but it's something I think we could spend a lot more time on. How do you work with people on that front? And then particularly if you could relate that to today's world, where we're doing a lot of things over Zoom, like how do you think about listening and using Zoom as a tool where it's just a very fundamentally different interaction than many of us are used to?
Yeah. Listening can be tricky. It takes a lot of energy to listen, actually, more than to speak, because you're listening for the verbal content, the word choices, the sentences, the meaning. Sometimes there's double entendres, right? Like what is said is not what is meant. There's the emotional side being communicated. And then there's the whole context. Well, the problem with Zoom is you don't have the context of where they are. If you're in a coffee shop together, that's your context, right? You can read their body language, you can read their facial a lot better. If you're not, they might be handling something in the background over here. You can't even see, it's off screen. And that is affecting their emotion. And now you're reading that emotion, but like, oh, did I say something wrong? Like, oh, so it's a lot like communicating through email or Slack, right? Like you're actually losing a lot of the context. And the problem is 70% of our communication is the voice and body language, is the non-spoken part. So we're losing like 70% of that communication that's happening, which is really tough. So you got to make that up. You got to make that up by asking clarifying questions, right? Oh yeah, how do you feel about this? And they're like, oh, grumpy face. And you're like, oh, is it bad, or you just smell something bad? Like what's going on? Like explain that visual, that physical response, because I can't assume the physical response is related to what we're talking about. Just like in an email, you can't assume that, if they say a sentence and you're like reacting really poorly to it, you're like, okay, maybe they meant something else here. I should clarify. So it's really taking a step and be like, okay, always clarify. I think that's the part. It's going to take a little bit longer, until you get to know that person. It's going to take a little bit longer to get through that communication so that you have clarity on the other end.
There's one really important point I think in there that you made, which is admit that it takes a lot of energy to listen. And so you have to prioritize it. It can't happen by accident. There was a story that I really enjoyed reading. It was a book called What Every Body is Saying. And it was by an FBI agent who spent his whole career, reading people's body language to try to get to what's really happening and not believing what they're verbally saying. And there's a lot of really interesting analogies to sort of business and work. And as one example, he would frequently advise or bring an extra person to a meeting where somebody was presenting and somebody was literally just listening. Like that was their entire job in the meeting. And afterwards, the person who's presenting would have a certain amount of context, but the listener would say, well, this person was uncomfortable when we talked about section 3. I could tell. And so we need to work on section 3 and we need to get them comfortable with it. Because if we don't, there's no way we're going to get this proposal through. And the person who's presenting just doesn't have the energy to both, take care of all of those things. And so I think just admitting that listening is an active, thing that takes a lot of energy and focus and prioritization. It's easy not to do that.
Yep, absolutely.
Do you have any kind of like recommendations or like practices or like anything like that you work on people with?
For listening?
Yeah.
Yes. In user interview sessions, I often recommend 2 people go in and then you share notes afterwards. So that helps you hear or see the other part of the conversation that you normally don't see. Right? Like I've done it so many times and it's really fun, actually. You go into a user interview for your product or whatever, 2 people, You both take notes and you don't talk to each other, and you both ask questions, of course. And then afterwards, you just compare notes. And like more often than not, you heard different things, which is amazing. You're like, how is this possible? If you can record it, you also record it and you can reference it back. But like spend some time decomposing that, right? Like afterwards, you interview for an hour, then you spend an hour just decomposing what happened. And you'll learn so much and you'll learn so much about how else to listen. I think part of it is having someone else show you different ways. Like, oh yeah, right here, they like frowned when they said that. So I think they are actually saying something else. And you're like, oh, I totally did not notice the frown because I was asking the question, right? Sometimes they're trying to be nice, like depending on the context that person's coming from, they don't want to say bad things about your product. That happens a lot, right? So they'll be like, oh yeah, no, this is okay. No, this is great. This part is so great. And if you're writing them down, you're like, oh, this part is so great, right? Like, and the other person's like, oh, this part was not so great. So you just have to be there, both be there, and kind of see what part you saw. Yeah.
It was one thing I was personally really, didn't understand ahead of time before getting to Silicon Valley and working for tech companies was how much of an art it is just talking to people that use your product and doing user interviews. Whether, it was at Twitter, we would have listening labs and they would videotape conversations with potential users and you couldn't interact with them. You just had to listen and watch it on video. And you learn so much by doing that you'd never learn when you just show an app to your friend on your phone and you coach them through it. You don't realize you're coaching them through it. But if all you can do is listen, it's actually a really powerful experience. Right.
It's true. Yes, we did that too. It was like a listening diet. Yeah. And you had to listen just for 2 minutes without saying anything. Just 2 minutes. It seems reasonable, but man, it's hard. You really want, like, all that judgment comes in. You're like, oh, I want to interpret what you're saying.
Yeah, I remember a number of moments at Twitter where we had a design. We thought it was perfect. We thought it was great. But you don't realize you're showing it to your friend. You're like, oh, just click here and this thing does that thing. And then you show it to somebody off the street. You literally just pull somebody off the street, interview them, see if they like it. And then they would look at it and say, I have no idea what this is or what I should do. And you're watching on video and you're like dying to show them what to do. It's so obvious, just click here. But when you're forced to just listen, sometimes you just have to handcuff yourself by doing something like being behind video. But I do think that kind of practice of learning to listen, and sometimes you have to force it, really is powerful for storytelling and leadership down the road.
Yeah. Hey, can we take a 1 minute pause? I need to adjust something so that the power works again on my computer.
Sure.
Okay.
So in the spirit of everybody working from home and working through these different situations with COVID, I'm actually coming here from New Jersey and I'm ominously looking out my window while the trees blow. And my power flickered a few times. So we're trying to do everything we can to have backup systems in place to make sure that no matter what, we can keep this conversation going. It looks like we've got a lot of great attention from around the world. And so when, on that note, people are joining us from all different places, all different countries. When you think about storytelling and you think about adjusting your message, part of it is C-suite or engineering or sales. How do you think about working with people that have to tell messages to people from a lot of different cultures or a lot of different, countries? How do you think about that?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. We just had a webinar on that recently. Where I had a leader from European background but works in Asia, and one who had Brazilian background but works in the US, and then I'm Chinese, and we had a moderator who's Chinese. So like kind of global leadership. And one of the points that was brought up is how easy it is for a message to be misinterpreted when you do cross-border communication. Like if you think it's hard enough now when I say something to be misinterpreted, like they used a word, what was it? Oh, cascade down. There was one example where the leadership was talking about, oh yeah, we're going to cascade down this policy once we establish it. And then they use that word cascade down. And nobody understood what that word meant internationally. Like the leadership did because they spoke English, but everybody else was like, I don't know what that means. So then basically the message was lost because they're like, they actually don't know what that means. They never looked it up. They're like, okay, whatever. They tell us a lot of things. So we'll just ignore that. The tendency is for people to just ignore communication they don't understand. So So I think a lot of care needs to be put into user testing your message. Like send it to somebody, like maybe a representative in each of those, and make sure they understand the message. When you speak slower, because English is just not their native language. I think that has to be considered when you do it. And then record the sessions. I think in the communication sessions, now that we're all remote anyway, you record it, and then they can play it back at a reduced speed or at an increased speed, so that everybody can get what they need, right? Like I sometimes listen to Spanish to kind of learn Spanish, and I would reduce the speed so that I can catch every word. And somebody who isn't your native language, they might need to do that. So you can encourage them to do that. Be like, I'm going to record this, and then you can use the dial and make it 0.8 or 0.7, whatever you need to understand. And I'm going to put captions. Captions are really good. People like to read the English. It's a lot easier. So yeah, always consider the crowd that isn't natively English speaking.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that. In thinking about sort of timely events right now in the US, it's an election week, and won't get into politics, but it's fair to say objectively that we're in a moment where trust and credibility are really hard to come by, and are maybe more important than ever. And by default, maybe that's not the case. And so how do you think about building trust and credibility? We talked about how your message resonates with people, but part of that also is just like over time, you telling your own like career story. And I think people can undervalue this, the power of how you not only tell stories in your job and for your product or your service, whatever it is, but how you tell your own story throughout your career and how you kind of control the future of your career arc. And a big part of that is trust and credibility. Do people trust that you're going to do what you say you're going to do? And like, how do you think about that when you talk to people about storytelling?
Building trust. That is the foundation, really, of your storytelling. You're trying to build that trust. And it's interesting, since we're still have animal brain in us, a lot of that trust just kind of unfortunately gets committed when you first meet somebody. That's what they say about first impressions is really hard to overcome. So as much as the content of what you're saying matters, actually the way you approach that person in the beginning when you first meet them matters even more, which is pros and cons, right? Like sometimes it's just something you need to be aware of and work on, I suppose. So you can have the best intentions, but if you stand a little too close to them from a personal distance perspective, and currently our personal distance is bigger bubbles than before, right? But they've inspected cultures, they've looked at different cultures and studied that, hey, the personal distance thing is a real thing. So Asian people stand a little closer, Western people stand a little farther, and that's a comfort zone thing. So if you get too close to their comfort zone, that is major animal brain alarm, right? Like they're like feeling this threat, and you can't, it's very hard to come back from that. So it's like being mindful of when you approach somebody, whether in person or in Zoom, whatever the cultural norms are, when it comes to building kind of first impression relationships, just make sure you hit all those check boxes, right? You're not coming too close to them. If you're supposed to look them in the eye, look them in the eye. If you're not supposed to, don't, right? Handshake or whatever the greeting is, like get those basics right, because that actually builds that foundation of trust. And then obviously over time, right, whatever you say, you action on, whatever you promise, you deliver. Like those are long-term trust building techniques. And of course, over time you build a relationship with that person through this type of trust, but you can't build that trust in day one. So day one is a lot more of the animal brain kind of a judgment, if you will. And so just being aware of that and complying with that, I think would help you build that initial trust.
Yeah, and talking about how you do things, I think is really important, and particularly in leadership, more and more you notice as people move forward in their careers, it's not just what you say and how you act, but it's how you approach certain problems, even simple things like timing of how you get other people involved. And I've found repeatedly that when you use we more than I, and you get other people involved with actually crafting the story, if you're a leader of an organization, you may be ultimately accountable for telling that story in certain environments. But if it's everybody's story and they feel like they're part of creating the story as opposed to you just projecting, then it's so much more powerful. as a product manager, in my career, when I first became a product manager and would sit in a room with engineers, we would do quarterly goals. And so we'd come in, and the first time I came in, I was like, all right, I've got a draft of what I think the goals should be, and now let's talk about it. And they, looked at me and were like, so you didn't even have the respect to ask us what we think before you wrote this up? I was like, okay, I got that one wrong. And so then the next quarter I came in, I was like, all right, guys, like, let's work on this blank sheet of paper. Like, what do you think our goals should be for this quarter? And then they looked at me and they're like, so you have no idea what we're doing. Like, why are you even here? I was like, okay, it's too late. And then you kind of find this delicate balance of people want their leaders to be fundamentally in control of the situation and feel like the leader knows where you're going. But at the same point, they want you to be open to, feedback. And so I had to find this delicate balance, which then resonated, which was, okay, I have a draft of what I think the general themes are of our goals, but there's a ton of room for input. So I'd love to hear what you think so that we can make sure there's nothing that needs to be added to the list. We can figure out later on what to delete from the list, how to focus it. Like, we have a starting point, but there's tons of room for input. I would like your input. And then you have to tune that per team. But I've found repeatedly that we make people part of the process of telling the story or creating the story, that they love hearing you tell it. And that can be wonderful as a leader. Yep.
Yeah, trust is a very loaded word. That what you just described is like stakeholder engagement and just bringing them on the journey, that is something that also builds trust. But trust is like this mega layer over top all of it, right? Trust is like, basically, at the end of the day, trust is, will I believe Keith will continue to act the way he is acting now? And do I believe that, Keith, the way he is acting now, is somebody that I want to connect with, right? So there's like two layers. There's the, are you a good person that I want to be hanging out with or doing business with? And then are you going to stay this good person, right? So like, I'm trying to interpret, because I'm predicting the future here, and I'm trying to kind of guess at your background. And so there's a lot of, I guess, trust. You can inherit trust, right? Like, you went to Cornell and you have that context about Cornell. So somebody who also went to Cornell would think, oh yeah, we have the same context. We probably have similar perspective on life. And so I trust that part of Keith, right? And so, you can have borrowed trust by being in the same org or having shared background and that kind of thing. And so a lot of people leverage that borrowed trust, right? When they meet somebody new, they're like, oh yeah, we have this, we both rock climb or whatever it is, right? So you can use some of those as well to help build that trust initially. Because it's hard to talk until you have that foundation of trust. It's hard to kind of go against the grain and have a deep conversation until you do. So it is a very important aspect.
And then one thing I've personally learned over time is that Warren Buffett has the quote where he describes, being honest and having certain values and approaches to the world. That's part of the job. But then the other job is making sure that people understand that, because their perception is really what matters. And so the perception of trust is what you're going after, which starts with honesty, but then it goes to a certain amount of storytelling to show your honesty so other people will believe it. And, I've run into problems. So like, part of his job is basically telling the story of how he's being honest, which feels weird. And it can feel uncomfortable, but it really is true. I've found situations I've been in where I've sort of put in a tremendous amount of effort to take everybody's, opinion into account and looked at like every single thing that every single salesperson had to say, et cetera, and like done all this work.
Doing that.
And, then presented an idea, and then, the head of sales would be like, extremely upset that I didn't take their view into account. And I'd feel hurt that like I spent a ton of time working on this. Like, how could you possibly feel that way? Where like, you may not agree with the decision, but you should understand the honesty and the value and the hard work that came, trying to get to that decision. And, sometimes I realized I hadn't told them, I hadn't explained that. And that was actually part of my job, was to do the honest approach, but then also to explain it to people what you're doing, because if you don't tell them, they won't know. And there's this weird human condition where a lot of times people assume the worst if they have silence. And so part of your job is not only being honest and trustworthy, but doing the messaging and communication, which is extra work, to show people that you're honest and trustworthy. And you kind of have to earn it over time. And it's a task in and of itself, kind of like when you're talking about listening.
Yeah, that's a great example. They want to be on the journey with you. They want to be in that story, They don't want to just, you don't watch a movie from the back, right? You don't just watch the ending, be like, oh yeah, Titanic sank, done. But you want to know the journey. That's the whole point of the movie. And so you're depriving them of the movie. when you just give them the solution. And I think that's what you're getting to here is they feel a little gypped, and part of it's like they're going to interpret whatever. They're going to fill in the story, basically. So yeah, telling them, very important.
So we have about 15 minutes left. Would love to open it up at this point for questions. We've already been incorporating some of the questions as much as we can as they come in. But at this point, we'll let the audience determine what kind of topics they want to hear about. So please enter your questions. We'll take as many as we can and pick a few to cover. While people are entering those, I'd love to kick off this section with one. I noticed a question earlier, which was really about like very short storytelling, like an elevator pitch. There's the famous elevator pitch where you're trying to get something across in 30 seconds. Yep. How do you think about coaching people to tell a super short, succinct story that still resonates?
Yeah, that's a great question. I just wrote a blog post that I haven't yet published on this. So timing is amazing. Yeah. If you got to figure out which elevator you're in, right? Are you in a Asian elevator that takes 10 minutes, or in a high rise, or are you in a US elevator where you get literally 10 seconds, right? So which elevator are you in?
You're doing the 30-second version.
You got a 30-second elevator. Okay, now you know how much time you have. Now, what are your goals for that 30-second? Let's assume it's a 30-second elevator. You're trying to get to a 2-minute pitch, really, because you can't really get real stuff through in 30 seconds, right? You need about 2 minutes. So in the 30 seconds, you're actually trying to earn 2 minutes later. So that's the goal. You gotta be really clear about that. And once you have that goal in mind, then you know how to edit it down. You're like, I don't need to tell them all the due diligence stuff. Like, I just need to tell them, okay, roughly we have this product, it does A, and we have this much customer traction, and we have some logos, right? It's exciting, these logos that we have. And if you want to talk, we can grab a coffee, or maybe I can walk you to your meeting, whatever it is, get that 2 minutes, right? Like, ask for that 2 minutes if they're interested. So you don't want to pile it all in. The tendency is for people to not pause. To just be like, let me tell you this so amazing, and the person is like, I cannot take, there's the elevator, ding, out, right? So you don't want to overwhelm them. Like, in 30 seconds, you only have enough for your name, for your company's name, for what you do and your audience, and maybe some examples of customers. That's it. That's all you have time for. And the ask. Can I walk you to your meeting? Can we sit down for 2 minutes? Can we, continue? That's it. Like, you gotta hold it back. You gotta hold it back. I think that's the biggest tip. Is just have some mystery. Mystery's good.
I think that's great advice. So moving to some of the questions that are coming in, and thank you everybody for entering them. Please continue. Michelle has a question about sales, saying, is it effective to share stories of other clients that have used your product successfully? Would love to hear what you think.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That is the gold mine. Everybody wants to know. Now, the trick in doing that technique is you got to pick a customer they respect, right? Like, if you pick the wrong brand, immediately they're out. They're like, we're not like that. Like, I don't want to associate with that, right? So that's the trick, I think, is teeing up the right, and then you got to do a bunch of listening ahead of time, right? You got to talk to their execs and be like, what brand, who do you think you want to be in 5 years? Like, what brand do you really respect? Like, kind of get a sense of, you might not have that brand, but then you pick a brand that's similar, and you can test it and be like, what do you think about, Acme? Like, is Acme a good company? And then you can get an earful, right? And then we're like, oh yeah, Acme's a good company, we respect them, where Acme's like, terrible. Don't use that example, because you'll start on the wrong foot. I think that, but once you get into the example, oh yeah, people perk up, because there's this FOMO is real. People, if they see that you're their competitor or someone they respect is using your product, they want to be there too.
Excellent. And, I would put a couple notes in there of my own, which is I noticed when mobile apps were first becoming really popular, so like 2008 to 2012, during that first transition, a lot of the marketing that you'd see was sort of stock photography of people with phones. But then a lot of times people will look at that and they'll spend all their time analyzing like that human who's holding the phone. And they would like, either it would resonate or it would really not resonate. And like so much of the energy was like, am I like this person or not? And then a lot of the marketing switched to just like a hand and a phone, or even just a phone. And like you could basically picture yourself in that person's shoes. So you weren't thinking about the other person, you're just picturing yourself in that moment. And I feel like whether it's a consumer product or a business product, your point about, pick a customer that people respect. I think that's really what you're getting at, is like, can you picture yourself in those shoes? And so you have to be careful. Sometimes it can go really wrong, where if you don't want to be in those shoes, or you don't think, oh, that doesn't relate to us, you can actually cause more harm than good. But if you're very careful about telling a few different stories, not trying to say you are just like this, but say, here are some of the areas where it's been successful, and imagine what it could do in your specific situation. You want them to picture themselves in that moment. And I've found that storytelling can be super important in other examples, but getting the right case study is critical.
Yeah.
In my experience. So looking at a few other questions, one of them is, do you have any books to read that helps to be a better listener? I have one that comes to mind for me. Would love to hear if you have any.
Books. You go first.
So this one's very specific to people that build technology products, but I think it's great for anybody that thinks about design and creativity. It's called Sprint, and is by the Google Ventures team, and they have this approach for building a prototype really rapidly. And they spend 1 week, and they basically spend that week talking to the team, talking to customers, and by the end of the week, they create a fake prototype. And it's usually something that's clickable on an iPad, but it's just a presentation that you click through, but it looks and feels like a product. And they use it to get a tremendous amount of feedback really, really rapidly with no engineering investment. And so it's one very specific tactical approach. But at the end of the day, I think that entire book is really about listening, and listening as effectively and as quickly as you can to get a ton of feedback of what your customers would actually do with a product. So that's one example.
Yeah, I like Crucial Conversations.
Okay.
Yeah, that one is very much about listening and dealing, especially difficult problems, and how to listen your way through it.
Somebody else was just asking about books on storytelling in general. Personally, I have a blog I've written for about 10 years called keithoncareers.com. I have a post on there called the Product Manager's List of things to read, watch, and listen to. I've got a bunch of books that I recommend on storytelling and sales, things on that nature. Are there any others that you recommend, not just listening, but storytelling in general?
Ooh, there are so many good ones. I think for storytelling, it's about paying attention when you come across stories, because I guess the theory of it is not that complicated. Like we discussed the story structure, and you can Google that in like 2 seconds. You can find the story structure, but it's practicing it that's going to be hard, and it's paying attention to the finer points. So when you're watching the next movie, right? Like think through, oh yeah, what narrative are they trying to? What arc is this? Who's the character? What is that tension? Why am I excited here? What is going on, right? Like, and self-examine. I mean, that makes the movie watching a little less exciting, but it is a learning experience, right? Where you're like self-examining your reaction and other people's reaction. You might talk about your reactions to it with somebody else. When you're reading an article, when you're listening to someone pitch to you, like what worked for you there, what didn't work for you there. Like just going through your life and paying attention to these is actually way more powerful than any theory on story that you could read about. Because we all interpret stories differently, and then understanding how other people interpret stories around you and in your life, I think that would be very instructive. So I recommend doing that exercise.
Excellent. Need is asking, how effective was the acting class that you took, and do you recommend that for other people that are looking to grow in their leadership?
Oh yeah, I do improv when I can. Now it's on pause. Acting is a great skill. It helps you come out of your comfort zone and just really explore the full high and low range of your capabilities, which I highly recommend. And it also helps you tap into like the different emotions that we all grow up, depending on our upbringing, suppressing certain emotions that are not okay in our society, whether that's sadness. I think in the US, like sadness is like, oh no, get happy. You're like, why are you sad? But in some cultures, it's not sadness. It's like happiness, actually. Happiness, like in Chinese culture, happiness is suppressed. So like there's some of these emotions that are actually suppressed that, I didn't think about that before, but now that I do this work, like, yeah. And how do you, how do you bring that into your being so that you can use that as well in your storytelling? I can be happy when I'm speaking to you, or I can be like, oh, it's like not a great day, but it's okay, right? Like how do you empathize with different people because they're going to project their emotions differently and connecting on that level. I think that's very powerful. So yeah, acting gives you that range, which is amazing. And what I did is take that acting and kind of interpret it for the business setting, right? Take the pieces that make sense and kind of condense it. So rather than taking a full-blown acting class, you just take the pieces that you need and cherry pick and then use it right away in business. That's what I'm targeting to help people with.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Chris has an interesting question. What or who are the enemies of great stories? And so I'm not sure exactly what he's getting at, but I'll paraphrase in terms of like, if you can tell us, if you're trying to tell a story and have it resonate, if something were to blow up, like what's that thing that could totally blow up your story, and how do you prepare so that you can try to avoid that or try to handle that, whether it's people, heckling you or not paying attention or, somebody at the end that asks a question in a snarky way. Like, how do you think about protecting your story so it doesn't get blown up by somebody or something?
Okay. There's the internal self-sabotage and then the external, right? There's two ways your stories can be blown up, as you say. The self-sabotage is usually too much information because stories are meant to be direct, short, easy to understand. You load it up with PhD level language and you're hosed, like you're done. Don't even try, right? Grade 8 level for business is perfect. And then keep it short, put in the pauses, right? People need time to hear what you said. The problem is I've told this 1,000 times, so I know what I'm going to say next, and I just want to go, blah, 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 keep going. But you don't know what I'm going to say next, and you're just trying to interpret what I just said. So I need to pause. So that's one. It's like the self-sabotage of this continuous talking. The second is not understanding your audience. That's another self-sabotage, which we've talked about already. And then the external sabotage could happen. I guess heckling is definitely one of them if you're in a stand-up routine situation. So you have to build in handling techniques, right? You have to assume that someone's going to heckle this and just have a response for it ahead of time, You could have people who just actually worse than heckling, because at least hecklers are engaged. Worse than heckling is the person who pulls out their phone. Here's my phone. I'm not listening to you. It's so obvious. Or they go like this. They're like, I'm not engaging, right? So they're not engaging. And the problem is you see that kind of ripple through the meeting room. As soon as one person leans back and pulls out their phone, guess what? Everybody else is pulling out their phone or their computer. So that is a lot harder to fight because they're not saying anything. So you can't directly address it. We're sabotageable. So, try and set that up, like no laptop in this meeting. Or if now that we're doing Zoom all the time, you can't no laptop it. So like only invite the people who are going to be engaged. Make sure they're talking. Make sure they have a moment where they're in charge of contributing, not just passive, right? You can't have passive meetings anymore because passive meetings means they're looking at something else on their screen because they're on their screen already. So running Zoom meetings and keeping people engaged is like extra hard. And I think that is the part you really need to watch out for.
I'll add one other very tactical thing. If it's a high stakes thing that you're trying to present and it's internal, so you're presenting to a bunch of people from other organizations within your company, whatever it is, and there are folks in the room that are cultural carriers or like leaders of other areas where they're very respected from other people. Like the worst thing that can happen if you're presenting to an engineering team is having the engineering leader that all the engineers love say, I don't think that's going to work for us. Like if they're not bought in, then their whole team like follows that. And so in times when you have the time to be able to preview it with them and work through it with them and make them part of the story. And then when you present and an engineer says, well, I'm not really sure about this. I'm just using engineering as an example. But like if somebody from that team says, I'm not sure about that. And then the leader of it says, well, you know what? I went through this earlier and I really do think it could work. Like that's huge. And so if you preview it with the people that have the most credibility and make sure that they're on board ahead of time, it can be really powerful. It's also time consuming. So you have to be careful. Now, we're just about out of time. So one final question, which I absolutely love from Angel, which is perfectly fitting. How do you effectively end a story?
With a big splash, as much as you can. Big splash.
All right. Well, Connie set us up there. So this is our big splash. Thank you so much for joining us. I thought this was awesome. And Connie, thank you for sharing, not only your own story and how this affects, your approach to business and leadership, but what I think are a lot of useful, pieces of information that folks out there can incorporate literally today into their daily life, whether it's in person, whether it's on Zoom. Storytelling and human connection and authenticity and trust and connection are so critical, both to you enjoying what you do and your passion, but also to being successful as a leader. So thank you so much for sharing it. And everybody online, thank you so much for joining us. This was a lot of fun, and we'll call that a wrap.
Yay, thank you.